In the dense forests of ancient Britain and Gaul, where oak trees stretched toward the heavens and mist clung to sacred groves, there lived a class of people so powerful that they could stop armies with a word, so learned that their training took 20 years, and so feared by Rome that an empire bent on conquest made their complete destruction a priority. These were the Druids, the priests, judges, and keepers of wisdom in Celtic society. For over 6 centuries, they wielded influence that extended far beyond the spiritual realm, serving as the intellectual backbone of one of Europe's most sophisticated ancient cultures. But who were the Druids really? Were they the wise nature worshippers of romantic imagination, or something far more complex and at times terrifying? Today we'll journey through the mists of time to uncover the true history of these enigmatic figures, separating fact from fiction and revealing why their story remains one of the most compelling chapters in ancient European history. Our tale spans from the earliest Celtic settlements to the final massacre on Anglesey, drawing from the accounts of Julius Caesar, Pliny the Elder, and other contemporary sources who witnessed the Druids at the height of their power. This is their story, complete, unvarnished, and utterly fascinating. The story of the Druids begins in the shadows of prehistory. The earliest known references to these Celtic priests date to the 4th century BCE, though their religious traditions can be traced back to at least 3000 BCE. They emerged from a complex mixture of indigenous Neolithic tribes of Britain and Celtic peoples who migrated from the east around 2000 BCE during the Great Indo-European migrations. The very name Druid tells us something about their nature. Most scholars believe it derives from Celtic roots meaning thorough knowledge or those with very great knowledge. An alternative etymology, proposed by Pliny the Elder, suggests it comes from the Greek word for oak, combined with a root meaning to know, giving us knower of the oak tree. This connection to oak trees would prove prophetic as these sacred groves became the heart of Druidic practice. By the 3rd century BCE, when the earliest detailed records appear, the Druids had evolved into a sophisticated priestly class that dominated Celtic society across Britain, Ireland, and parts of Gaul. They were not merely religious figures, but represented the intellectual elite of their civilization. Philosophers, scientists, legal experts, and political advisors all rolled into one. What made the Druids unique among ancient priesthoods was their complete reliance on oral tradition. Despite being literate, they were prevented by doctrine from recording their knowledge in written form. This decision would prove both their strength and their ultimate weakness. While it preserved the purity of their teachings and maintained their monopoly on knowledge, it also meant that when the last Druids died, much of their wisdom died with them. Druidic society was highly organized and hierarchical. At its apex stood a single leader, chosen by vote or, if necessary, through armed conflict. This archdruid ruled until death, when the selection process would begin anew. The authority of this leader was absolute within the Druidic order and commanded respect even from Celtic kings and nobles. The path to becoming a Druid was extraordinarily demanding. Young men, and the evidence suggests the priesthood was predominantly male, would spend up to 20 years in training. This wasn't merely religious instruction, but a comprehensive education that would make them the most learned individuals in their society. The curriculum was vast and varied. Students learned ancient verse, natural philosophy, astronomy, and the lore of the gods. They studied the movements of celestial bodies, developing both lunar and solar calendars. They mastered law, becoming expert arbitrators who could settle disputes between tribes. They learned the healing properties of plants, serving as the primary medical practitioners in their communities. Perhaps most importantly, they memorized the entire oral tradition of their people, myths, genealogies, laws, and religious practices passed down through generations. This knowledge was considered so sacred that it could never be committed to writing, ensuring that only those who had undergone the full training could access the deepest mysteries of Celtic culture. The training took place in secret locations, caves, forest clearings, and sacred groves where students would gather around their masters, absorbing knowledge through repetition and memorization. This system created an intellectual elite whose authority was unquestioned and whose knowledge was irreplaceable. The Druids occupied a unique position in Celtic society that had no parallel in the ancient world. They were simultaneously priests, judges, teachers, and political advisors, wielding power that transcended traditional boundaries. As religious leaders, They controlled all aspects of Celtic spiritual life. They organized public and private sacrifices, interpreted omens, and served as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. Their most fundamental teaching was the immortality of the soul and its transmigration after death, a doctrine that profoundly influenced Celtic attitudes toward life and death. In their judicial capacity, Druids served as the supreme legal authority. They judged both public and private disputes, and their decisions were final. Anyone who disobeyed a Druidic decree faced the ultimate punishment: excommunication from religious festivals, which effectively made them social outcasts. This power to exclude individuals from the spiritual community gave Druids enormous leverage over Celtic society. Their educational role was equally important. As the keepers of all knowledge and history, they were living libraries who preserved Celtic culture through oral tradition. They taught not only religious doctrine but also practical subjects like astronomy, mathematics, and natural science. Many young nobles were sent to study with the Druids, creating networks of influence that extended throughout Celtic society. Perhaps most remarkably, Druids enjoyed extraordinary privileges. They were exempt from military service and paid no taxes. They could travel freely between territories, even during times of war, and their persons were considered sacred and inviolable. According to classical sources, if Druids intervened between two armies, they could stop a battle through their moral authority alone. The religious practices of the Druids were as complex as they were controversial. At the heart of their spirituality lay a deep reverence for nature, particularly oak trees and the mistletoe that grew upon them. The only eyewitness account of a Druidic ceremony comes from Pliny the Elder, who described a ritual involving the harvesting of mistletoe. In this ceremony, a white-robed Druid would climb an oak tree and cut mistletoe with a golden sickle, catching it in a white cloth before it could touch the ground. 2 white bulls would then be sacrificed. As Pliny noted, the Druids held nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and the tree that bears it, always supposing that tree to be the oak. Early Druidic rites were conducted in forest clearings and sacred groves, emphasizing their connection to the natural world. These outdoor temples reflected their belief that the divine was present in nature itself, not confined to human-built structures. Only later, under Roman influence, did they begin using constructed buildings for worship. However, it was their practice of human sacrifice that most horrified Roman observers and ultimately provided justification for their suppression. The most infamous method involved constructing huge wickerwork figures, filling them with living victims, and setting them ablaze. The Roman Senate had banned human sacrifice in 97 BCE, and the continuation of this practice by the Druids became a major factor in Roman efforts to eliminate them. The collision between Druidic tradition and Roman expansion was inevitable. As Julius Caesar conquered Gaul between 58 and 51 BCE, he encountered the Druids at the height of their power and influence. Caesar's detailed account in his Commentary de Bello Gallico provides our most comprehensive contemporary description of Druidic society. Initially, Caesar seemed fascinated by the Druids, describing their roles and practices with apparent respect. However, Roman attitudes quickly hardened as they recognized the political threat posed by this powerful priestly class. The systematic suppression began under Emperor Augustus, who decreed that no one could be both a Druid and a Roman citizen. This was followed by more severe measures under Tiberius, who introduced laws banning not only Druidic practices but also other native soothsayers and healers. The final blow came under Emperor Claudius, who in 54 CE completely abolished the barbarous and inhuman religion of the Druids in Gaul. In Britain, the process took longer, but the outcome was the same. As Roman forces pushed westward, the Druids retreated to their strongholds, eventually making their final stand on the island of Anglesey, which served as their primary sanctuary and training center. The year 60 CE marked the beginning of the end for the ancient Druids. Under orders from Emperor Nero, Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus launched a campaign to destroy the Druidic stronghold on Anglesey, known to the Romans as Mona. The island of Anglesey held special significance for the Druids. It was their holy island, the center of their culture, and their last major stronghold in Roman-controlled Britain. Here, in sacred groves hidden within ancient forests, the Druids had maintained their traditions and continued training new initiates, even as Roman control tightened around them. As Roman soldiers approached the Menai Strait that separates Anglesey from mainland Wales, They encountered a sight that initially struck fear into their hearts. According to Tacitus, the Druids lined the opposite shore, raising their hands to heaven and screaming dreadful curses. The psychological warfare was intense. These were not ordinary priests, but figures who commanded supernatural dread even among battle-hardened Roman legionaries, but curses and intimidation could not stop Roman steel. The soldiers crossed the strait and stormed the island. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Romans systematically destroyed both the Druids and their sacred groves, burning the ancient trees that had served as outdoor temples for centuries. The destruction was thorough and deliberate. The Romans understood that they were not merely conquering territory, but eliminating a way of life that had persisted for over 6 centuries. The sacred groves were burned, the Druids were slaughtered, and the oral traditions that had been carefully preserved for generations died with their keepers. The massacre at Anglesey marked the effective end of Druidism as an organized religion in Roman-controlled territories, but it was not quite the end of the story. Some Druids managed to escape the Roman onslaught, fleeing to Ireland, where Roman rule never extended. In Ireland, the Druids faced a different kind of challenge. As Christianity spread across the island, the old religion found itself competing with a new faith that offered many similar concepts, including the immortality of the soul that had been central to Druidic teaching. The transition was gradual but inexorable. By around 750 CE, the word Druid appears in Christian poetry, but now in a context that acknowledges the superiority of Christian teaching. The poet Blaithmac wrote of Jesus as being better than a prophet, more knowledgeable than every Druid. This represents a crucial shift. Druids were no longer seen as powerful religious authorities, but as representatives of a superseded pagan past. In medieval Irish literature, Druids appear frequently in myths and legends, but they are portrayed quite differently from their historical counterparts. These literary Druids are often depicted as sorcerers and magicians who opposed the introduction of Christianity, reflecting the Christian scribes' need to diminish their predecessors while acknowledging their cultural importance. The ancient Druids had lost their priestly functions but survived in transformed roles as poets, historians, and judges. Their deep knowledge of law, genealogy, and traditional lore remained valuable even in a Christian context, allowing some elements of their tradition to persist in new forms. The story of the ancient Druids is ultimately one of both triumph and tragedy. For over 6 centuries, they represented the intellectual and spiritual pinnacle of Celtic civilization, preserving knowledge, maintaining justice, and serving as bridges between the human and divine worlds. Their influence extended far beyond religion into every aspect of Celtic life, making them one of the most powerful priestly classes in ancient Europe. Yet their very success contained the seeds of their destruction. Their reliance on oral tradition while preserving the purity of their teachings made their knowledge vulnerable to extinction. Their political influence made them targets for Roman suppression. Their practice of human sacrifice provided moral justification for their elimination. The historical Druids were far more complex than modern popular culture suggests. They were not simply nature-loving mystics, but sophisticated intellectuals who combined religious authority with political power, scientific knowledge with spiritual insight. They were capable of both profound wisdom and shocking brutality, reflecting the contradictions of their age. Their legacy lives on in multiple ways. The Celtic reverence for nature, the concept of the soul's immortality, and the integration of spiritual and practical knowledge all bear Druidic influence. Modern Druidic movements, while having little direct connection to their ancient predecessors, continue to draw inspiration from their example. Perhaps most importantly, the Druids remind us that history is written by the victors. Almost everything we know about them comes from Roman sources, their enemies and destroyers. We can only imagine what their own accounts might have revealed about their beliefs, practices, and worldview. The ancient Druids vanished from history as they had lived, shrouded in mystery, their deepest secrets dying with them in the sacred groves of Anglesey. But their story continues to fascinate us, offering glimpses into a world where wisdom and power, nature and divinity were inseparably intertwined. In understanding the Druids, we better understand not only the ancient Celtic world, but also the complex relationship between knowledge, power, and survival that shapes all human societies. Their tale serves as both inspiration and warning, a reminder of what can be achieved when learning is valued and wisdom is preserved, and what can be lost when that knowledge exists only in the minds of mortals.